Welcome back, old family and new family, to BoomBappED, capital ED. This is your co-host with the most, Brandon White, a.k.a. Bushido Garvey, as some rap people know me as.
Yes, y'all. This is Atlas coming at you. Peace.
Yes. And we got Brother Rob Lowe on the tech, and we are going to continue with part 2 of our really enlightening interview with Dr. Walter Cooper, Regent Emeritus, scholar extraordinaire, activist extraordinaire, and Rochester dignitary. Thank you again, Dr. Cooper, for your time. In part one, we talked a bit about a couple things. We talked about music and the movements during music. We talked about this whole idea of protest and athleticism. We also talked about this idea of exposing more of our kids to STEM. And in that story, you said something interesting about a principal who, was a black woman, but still didn't have the buy-in that you would think a black woman would have for children of color for STEM, which is a really good reflection for this question I'm going to ask you. I was doing some knowledge, and that's hip hop talk for being studious. I was being studious and scholarly for a second, and I was reading this book of collected writings from Dr. Freddie Thomas, who's another Rochester dignitary.
A friend of mine.
Yes. So you guys knew each other. Yeah,
actually I wrote a foreword to his book.
Yes, A Silent Leader.
Yeah.
Right? Yes. Actually I have that book in my bag right now. But when reading some of his writings, he talked about this idea, and I was shocked because I just didn't expect him to be writing about this. He brought up this idea of black people being in charge of their own education system, right? But he also said that he wouldn't necessarily live to be around for that, right? And he was talking locally, at least from the context I was reading it. What are your thoughts about this idea, and what are your opinions about what the best ways are to mobilize teachers of color?
I think the problem with just our control of our own educational destiny is that we don't have the economic base to really support it to the extent that it should be. And I think classically we could look at the historical black colleges and universities, except for a few cases like Howard University and Morehouse and a couple more. The underfunding for science and technology is a tremendous barrier for the development along those lines. But I think I look at my own career, and I think that we have to expose our children to good teaching. See, good teaching can compensate for poverty and other issues in a child's life. I started first grade in 1934. General unemployment was 41%, so everybody was essentially poor. And I went to school with a large number of students whose parents came from Europe. They were the ethnics. And in the neighborhood I lived, we had a large number of ethnics, and went to school. No buses, but you walked. This was in Western Pennsylvania. But I was exposed to good teaching, teachers who knew what my interests were. And on many occasions, I was not denied what I would consider was due me as a student. I was president of the National Honor Society. I won a scholarship to Duquesne University based upon the fact that in Western Pennsylvania, Allegheny County, Pittsburgh being the center of it, the graduating seniors who had taken college prep in high school had the option of taking a standardized examination with other students in the county, and generally you would have about 2,000 or 3,000 students taking the exam. And so I placed high enough to be offered scholarships. to Duquesne University. Those days I thought I was a pretty good football player. Coming from a large family, I'd had 5 sisters and 1 brother. So I was interviewed by the director of admissions at Duquesne University, a Father Federici. You know, it was a religious school. And so he went through the litany of praising my background, experience, and everything. And after he finished, I said, well, Father Federici, I come from a very poor family, but I made all Monongahela Valley in football, and I would prefer to play football to offset some of the expenses. Father Federici said, you know, he turned red, and I knew something was wrong. And he said, well, the institution has scheduled Wake Forest, North Carolina State, and some other Southern schools, and if we have an athlete of color on the squad, they would cancel the game. And so I said, you mean to tell me that you were, now remember, I'm a 17-year-old, this is May 1946, and I said, do you mean to tell me that you would admit me full-time as a student, but deny me the opportunity to participate in all the extracurricular activities of this institution? He flushed, and then he said, I don't make the rules. I said, under those circumstances, I can't attend your college. So I had interviewed at Washington and Jefferson College, and they gave me a 4-year scholarship, academic football scholarship. So I never had to pay money to go to school.
If is this the same institution that when you came back to try to work at, they wouldn't let you?
That was when I was graduating from Washington and Jefferson College.
So the very same school that let you in, when you wanted to work for them, they were like, no.
No, it was DuPont that denied me a job, commercial jobs. The school was okay because in 1920 it had a black quarterback.
Oh, wow.
Yes.
In this era of globalism and in this internet age where everything is connected, do you think it wrong-headed to pursue a Pan-African or an Afrocentric education system in these United States? Or do you think it's simply not economically feasible?
No, but I think, in a sense, if I review my life, I would say I'm a Pan-Africanist. And I think, you know, I'm an American, but I'm an African. You never find someone who came to this country from Italy and is an Italian-American. They'll tell you, I'm an Italian. And so why do we have to say that we're African-American? I said, I'm African. And I've had a long-term interest in Africa, and I visited the continent on more than several times. Went to Timbuktu twice. And in one, I spent 6 weeks in sub-Saharan Africa on an occasion in 1977. And so I placed upon myself the responsibility to know where people of African ancestry came from. And so that's why I was interested in Timbuktu, the history of Africa, shaped some of the writers, intellectual writers of Africa. And they'll lay it out for you, as Sheikh Anta Diop from Senegal, the African origin of civilization. And when I came to the University of Rochester as a graduate student in 1952, I came from shouting Baptist background, but my wife was an Episcopalian, and so we used to go to Old St. Simon's Episcopal Church, 6.5 Oregon Street. So I took it upon myself, 1953 and 54, to teach 1 day a week African American history out of E. Franklin Frazier's African American History, which he published in 1949. Most of those students who were exposed to that went on to college. Moses Gilbert, Dickie Bawdy, Norman Brown, Peggy Brown, and on and on. And so I'm certainly dedicated to children being exposed to their history. We don't even know the history of our families here in the United States.
Right.
I've looked into mine. I believe firmly in it, and on both sides of my family, my great aunt was the first person to get a college education in the family. She was born 1885. She lived until 2006. She went to Tuskegee and Fort Valley State Teachers College. She must have had a Russian professor or read Russian literature, because she named all the girls of my mother's generation. My mother's name was Luda, which is Russian. She had a sister, Katerina, and one, Irina. Russian names.
You have a question?
Yeah, well, because I was thinking, sorry, but because I was thinking about our conversation prior to recording, and then thinking about what you told us about your experience in educating children in church about African American history. And you know, when you read a lot of your interviews and your writings, you know, you call the church to task, and because there's this element that you've cited that they've forgotten their past with literacy and education outside of the actual preaching, outside of the actual scripture, or not using grounding scriptures, grounding emancipation in this country in scriptural experiences, right? Can you expound a little bit about that and why you feel like it's changed and it's not there anymore?
Well,
or in the same way?
I think that James Baldwin, in his The Fire Next Time, he relates how, you know, he was a child evangelist after running the streets of Harlem, and he then got retreated from the church because he said the social pathologies of the street have actually been transmitted into the church. And if you think about it, there's more than a relevance of truth in that. So I think that our church is our only unique institution which has been developed in the United States, 1783, by Richard Allen and Absalom Jones. They did it with a dramatic antagonism against the segregation and attitude that had developed in the church, the integrated church, St. George's Methodist Episcopal Zion Church in Philadelphia. So you had this institution founded on some kind of dramatic decision-making by the founders. But if you look at the end of the Civil War, what was the function of the church? The national black church bodies were much like the Quakers and organizations funded by the Rosenwald Fund in trying to bring literacy to these newly freed, unlettered slaves. It was the same national church bodies that worked with the Freedmen's Bureau in Congress and also the Morrill Act, and they became the fount of the historical black colleges and universities. So there was a dynamic interest in education from a historical perspective. But now you look at the church, well, very few black churches teach black history. Very few black churches, I imagine, has an education committee with a lodestone of information which is essential to the young people of their congregation. So I think there's a rich history or rich legacy But you look for the memory, and it's not there. Do churches have libraries? Do churches teach African American history, which our children ought to know? Give them some semblance of reality in terms of their pride and in terms of their history. And so I'm critical, particularly at this time of our history in this country. You know, we still, you know, we're free from slavery, but quasi-slavery still exists. And I often say that, you know, during slavery, it was obvious that we were none but chattel, you know, for economic determinism by the white slave owners. But now, we still operate under semi-slavery because there is no, we allow and we permit our urban educational system, where most of us are educated, to decay into institutions that do not present the opportunity of success, but the opportunity of failure.
Dr. Cooper, you identify, seem to point to the early 60s as a transition. And at a time when education became de-emphasized by leadership, by community leaders and activists, and even within the educational ranks themselves, the quality of you're critical of the quality of leadership from that point forward, and you point to a number of things that happened between the civil rights movement dying out and there being less national, Rochester being less exposed to activities going on nationally. You also point to locally the departure of some of the important players in the local NAACP, the establishment of the Fight organization and some of the tension between Fight and Urban League, and to local activists having a kind of a myopic focus on housing and jobs, and again de-emphasizing education. Is that fair?
I think you've summed it up very well. I've seen. I've kind of given a look at historical perspectives in my hometown and Rochester. Now think about this. When I was going to the Baptist Church in Clayton, Pennsylvania, Morning Star, we had Sunday morning, 9 o'clock, Sunday school, 11 o'clock, Sunday service, and if the minister didn't feel too well, we got home at 1:30, and then at 6 o'clock was the Baptist training unit. So you spent all that time in church. Then I'd look at my white classmates going to the Catholic Church, the Greek Reformed Church, the Lithuanian Church, and I said, boy, they seem to get many more blessings than I do, and I spend more time in church than they could ever imagine. So I, in my mind, it was scientific at that time, so I plotted the curve that the blessings received are inversely related to the time spent in church.
All right.
Well, you think about that. Instead of being home, enriching the mind, reading a book, reading some history, you were tied up in the church. And so I asked myself the question, this unique institution of ours, what has it done in changing times, changing economic times and so forth for us? They haven't changed their program. I asked the question, well, where's the church library? Where's the change of the order of service? Why can't we open up service with lift every voice and sing? And why can't we have a layperson take a book out of the church's library, read it, and give a 20-minute review of what she read, and it's germane to the congregation? And why can't, we have just one collection? Because all, let's make even money, but all money is even. And then why can't we end our services with Kosi Sikalele Africa, God bless Africa? That's where we came from, that's our roots. And when my white friends said, do you know much about your forefathers? I said, yeah, my forefathers were given a free cruise trip from Africa to the United States with special quarters below deck. But what I'm trying to examine is in a world that's changing very fast, technically especially, and why are we standing still and just not giving due consideration to the fact that we have to educate our children differently? They have to have the best education possible, because they're going to enter a world that's highly competitive and it's global in dimensions. And so a people that does not have a knowledge base are actually exposed to the whims and caprices of those who are in control, like here in the United States. And I think we have to acknowledge that we are in a political time now where there's deep resentment of any accomplishment on the part of blacks. And that's what the new administration has done. He's touched the sentiment of a large segment of the white population that we should have never had a black president. And that's an overguiding principle. So I'm deeply concerned, and I'm worried. My children are off, but I'm deeply concerned about our present generation. We don't pass around information like we should. The parents whose children go to the school named in my honor, I've apprised them of the RIT City Scholars. I've apprised them of the Excelsior Scholarship. I never want a parent to come to me and say, you never let us know about these opportunities. I give them as much information as I have and as much perspective on situations confronting their children than I have.
You kind of forming this question as I go, Dr. Cooper. I've read some of your thoughts about civic leaders in the 60s also oftentimes were highly accomplished academics. They paired the two. There was no there was no disconnect there. It was seamless. And do you see that as something that has changed over the years, where there's kind of one or the other? There's a focus in one of those two lanes, and that having affected the culture of movements and the nature of our change agents today versus back in the 60s in a critical way?
Yeah, well, I actually, in conversations with the few leaders of the 60s, and we would say, we both conclude those were the Camelot years for us. And why do I say that? You had young educated blacks who participated in freedom rides, picketing. We picketed February 13th, I believe, of 1960, 62, we did sympathy picketing of F.W. Woolworth and some theater chains because of their discriminatory practices in the South. I think it was a time where there was a genuine feeling of unity with our brothers and sisters in the South. You had an NAACP with almost 4,000 members. You had a Ralph Bunche Scholarship Committee. You had a Congress on Racial Equality that was chaired by a school teacher by the name of Hannah Storrs. So, I don't see that kind of aggressive activity on the part of the community in general and school teachers. Those days, we had people who fought police brutality, documented it. I documented it, 14 cases of extreme police brutality. The Rufus Fairwell case, the A.C. White case, the Face-On case. All of these were designed to put blacks in their place. You could tell you knew the police who were constantly involved in brutality against blacks. You knew that the police department had a policy of actually having K9 dogs around the skating rink on Chestnut Street that was frequented by young blacks. And you knew, of course, of the extreme housing discrimination because you had experienced it. The Tolliver case on Verena Street. When I first went to purchase a home in 1958, I was told by the mortgage department I was going to move out into Henrietta. And I was told, why do you want to get away from your people? So, pardon me, those were the attitudes that were in your face. I chaired a committee, which I was very interested in education. That's always been my focus. In July 1960, the school district had announced that they were going to put 900 students out of schools, 3, 4, and 19, on half-day sessions. I was chairing the education committee of the NAACP at that time. I went before the board with a statement. The statement was that we're only 3 years removed from the Russians orbiting Sputnik #1. And all the school systems across the nation are trying to revitalize themselves to meet the potential of an impending threat from the Soviet Union. Not once did I mention race. Next day in the newspaper, you could go back and pull it out, July 8th, 1960, black leader charges school district with racial discrimination. Not once did I mention race. My boss at Kodak, of course, was shaken. I lost a wage increment at Kodak that year. And so you prorate it over another 20 years of my employment. I lost a lot of money. But I think we as people are going to have to start dealing with reality and not what I would call irrelevant activities that do not contribute to the health, safety, and future of African Americans in this community.
We might have to do a part 3 because I'd love to hear your thoughts about how current culture and hip-hop fits into those plans about what we must do, even though we only have about 60 seconds left of this particular episode. And I know Garvey has a lot more questions and whatnot to ask.
Just as he was speaking, I was like, oh my gosh, there's so many questions that keep on popping up in my mind. So we're not. What do you thinking there?
We'll talk offline, but I'm hopeful that we'll be able to chew your ear and hear some of your thoughts another time also.
I'm willing to share.
Yeah.
That's beautiful.
Yeah, I think one thing that was operative in the early 60s, you had the young, interested, intelligent blacks who would get together. Like, they would make the decision who's going to go on the Freedom Ride. Well, LaPloy Ashford, Lakey Ashford went on the Freedom Ride. So, but I don't see that kind of thing going now. And I've talked at the Boys and Girls Club and so forth. But to see young blacks of the same philosophical interests coming together and doing things like going to the Board of Education and said, we're tired of this irrelevant education that you're putting down on a new generation.
What I'm thinking, so this will be episode 2.